The stage is set for war in the Pacific. Japan has pursued an act of aggression against the United States in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The United States has decided to respond and is now involved in war in the Pacific. In the following broadcast, major events of the war in the Pacific will be explained.
The war in the Pacific was a major part of history for both the Japanese and the American armies. This game-changing part of the war would not have been made possible without key figures from both sides of the war effort. From the American side, Douglas MacArthur earned a notable spot in history. As General of the Pacific, he successfully oversaw the Allied occupation of post-war Japan. In addition, he famously liberated the Philippines in 1944 after it fell to the hands of the Japanese army. Another famous American from the war in the Pacific was Chester N. Nimitz. In 1939, Nimitz was appointed chief of the Bureau for Navigation of the U.S. Navy. After skill shown during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was elevated to commander of the Pacific Fleet, then to admiral of the Pacific Fleet in 1944. Throughout World War II, he made an impact as chief of naval operations. From the Japanese side, one of the most important World War II figures was Hideki Tojo, the Japanese prime minister. The monarch played an active role in the war effort and commanded forces to bomb Pearl Harbor after U.S. embargo on oil and steel in Japanese-occupied French Indochina. During his reign, he also helped finalize attacks on the UK, US, and Dutch East Indies. Another important figure from the Japanese war effort was General Masahiro Homma, a military attaché for the UK a decade before. Homma was in charge of the Bataan Death March. His performance during the gruesome event showed his lack of military and leadership ability. He was later convicted of war crime and put to death by firing squad under the order of MacArthur.
The date is April 9th, 1942. 2,000 American forces, aided by a force of poorly trained Filipino forces, has been able to hold off a fierce Japanese attack. They are running out of food and supplies and have been forced into eating the local horses and donkeys to survive. General MacArthur has been ordered to evacuate and promised to return again. American troops have surrendered and are now at the will of the cruel Japanese. The Japanese forced the Americans to walk 65 miles in the intense heat. Any soldier who could not walk was shot. Thousands died during the march, and thousands more died from disease, mistreatment, and starvation in the prisoner of war camps. The date is April 18th, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle launched an air raid on Japan. It included 16 B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier 650 miles east of Japan. The raid did little actual damage to Japan, but hurt the government's prestige. One B-25 came close enough to the Japanese Premier Hideki Tojo that he could see the pilot of the plane, but it never fired a shot. They believe that the attack originated from Midway Island and authorized a counterattack on the island. The raid showed that small islands that the Japanese government had overlooked until this time could be used as a place to launch attacks on Japan, while still having enough fuel to be able to safely land in China. When the men who went on the raid returned to the U.S., special silver goblets were made with each of their names on it to commemorate the raid. Along with the goblets, a special bottle of whiskey was created with the instructions to open it when there were only 2 members of the raid surviving. This tradition of honoring the fallen soldiers will serve to help make sure that we never forget the sacrifices they made.
Good morning, America. Now that you've heard about Doolittle's March, it's time to hear about something new. We'll be talking about 2 battles which were very impactful in the Pacific Theater and World War II as a whole. We will go in chronological order, so we will start with the Battle of Coral Sea. The battle began about 5 months after Pearl Harbor on May 4th, 1942, and carried on for 4 days until it concluded on May 8th. It took place some 500 miles off the coast of Australia in the Coral Sea, hence the name of the battle. It held some major significance because it was the first naval battle of World War II. This was also the first all-carrier battle to have ever happened. Another interesting fact was that during the fight, neither side could actually see each other with the naked eye. Neither side knew what they were getting into going into this fight. This was a learning experience that was valuable to both sides for future battles that would later on ensue. The way the battle was fought was with carriers. Both sides would launch planes off the carriers to go attack the enemy's ships. The first 3 days were exactly this. Both sides would set on recon planes, basically just dropping a bit of ordnance here and there on each other and just poking each other. The fourth and last day was when the main battle happened. The battle was chaotic and both sides suffered some losses. Neither side came out victorious. Instead, they both gained a knowledge of how to fight next time and different advantages. The advantage that the Japanese gained was that they had sunk a 41-ton American ship for only an 11-ton ship of their own. The advantage the U.S. had gained was this battle prevented Japan from landing on Port Moresby and invading it. The Battle of Coral Sea led to a more important battle later on. So following that perfect segue, we will talk about the Battle of Midway, which was one of the most important battles of all of World War II. The Battle of Midway took place at the Midway Islands, which was home to a small airstrip in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The reason it was important was because it was a place where the aircraft could refuel instead of returning to their aircraft carriers, so they could go on longer missions. It was very imperative that the U.S. had control of it. The battle itself spanned over 2 days. The way it started was the Japanese knew that the U.S. was trying to set up a foothold at the Midway Islands and they wanted to prevent this. Yamato Isoroku, the Japanese naval commander, still viewed his fleet as superior to the U.S. naval fleet, so he decided he wanted to engage. He sent 4 heavy aircraft carriers and 3 light cruisers. Their orders were to engage and destroy the American fleet. However, the U.S. had recently cracked the Japanese naval code, so they were aware of the fleet heading their way, so they prepared for a fight. The U.S. scrounged up 3 heavy aircraft carriers and anchored about 150 miles north of Midway, awaiting the Japanese arrival. The Japanese had no idea they were sailing into a fight where they were at a major disadvantage. The U.S. had land-based air support while the Japanese had none. The battle began on the morning of June 4th when the U.S. sent bombers from Midway to attack the Japanese, but these bombings were ineffective. The Japanese retaliated by sending bombers of their own to attack Midway, and they were very effective. The Japanese carriers also escaped this assault without taking too much damage. The Japanese then instantly sent another wave of bombers to finish off the airstrips at Midway. During this attack, the U.S. fleet was spotted and attacked. The Japanese sunk many U.S. torpedo bombers in this attack, but the U.S. responded. They sent dive bombers to attack the Japanese, and fortunately, they attacked at a time when the Japanese carriers had a lot of fuel and ordnance on their decks, so the bombings were very successful. The U.S. sunk 3 heavy carriers and 1 cruiser. During this attack, the Japanese were also attacking the U.S. They had sunk the Yorktown, but the battle had ended a U.S. victory and the Japanese defeat. The Japanese defeated on June 6 and provided the U.S. with dominance over the Pacific Ocean, which proved to be a very important accomplishment in World War II.
The island hopping campaign was the strategy of taking control of islands, one after the other, until Japan was in reach of American bombers. As ships moved closer to Japan, the outposts behind them were weakened so that they could no longer be considered a threat. This strategy was started after the Battle of Midway. Some islands were captured by direct fighting. Other, more heavily protected bases were neutralized by heavy bombings. This strategy was crucial in the victory of the United States over Japan.
The battle at Leyte Gulf was one of the largest naval battles in history. Only lasting 3 days, October 23rd through 26th of 1944, it turned out to be an overwhelming defeat for the Imperial fleet. Of the 282 warships engaged, 216 of which were American, 2 Australian, and 64 Japanese, the Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses totaled in 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. During this battle, the Japanese had their first successful kamikaze attack, but for all practical purposes, their navy had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force, and this victory admitted the United States into the Philippines.
In the fall of 1944, the United States military needed land to build their B-29 superfortresses. The Americans hoped the new bombing technology would put them ahead in the fight against the Japanese. Unfortunately, Japanese troops based on Iwo Jima, a small Pacific island, continued to intercept the B-29 bombs. The American troops needed to do something fast. On February 19, 1945, 70,000 Americans attacked Iwo Jima, hoping to gain control of the island. The 28,000 Japanese soldiers hid in caves, dugouts, and underground installations, making the battle difficult for the Americans. On March 16th, the United States reigned victorious and gained control of the island with 7,000 American casualties and 20,000 injured. The U.S. took the remaining 216 Japanese soldiers as prisoners of war after the month-long battle. After the battle concluded, the island was used as an emergency landing site for U.S. airmen and landed 27 soldiers a Medal of Honor.
Hello viewers, let's talk about the USS Indianapolis. The USS Indianapolis was carrying the first operational atomic bomb. Once the bomb was delivered to the island of Titane on July 26, 1945, the USS Indy received new orders to go join the USS Idaho at Leyte Gulf to prepare for invasion of Japan. The USS Indianapolis departed, unescorted, for Leyte. 14 minutes past midnight on July 30th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis was hit by 2 torpedoes. The first torpedo hit the hull, causing minimal damage, but the second torpedo hit midship, causing the ship to split in half and sink. Of the 1,196 men on the ship, only about 900 made it to the water with little supplies. When the sun rose on July 30th, sharks began attacking the men. The attack continued until the men were physically extracted from the water 5 days later. This attack was one of the most devastating attacks on man. By the end of these devastating attacks, only 316 men lived to tell the tale of the USS Indianapolis. Now that we've talked about the USS Indianapolis, let's talk about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped the world's first deployed atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb destroyed 90% of the city, and it also killed about 80,000 people immediately. 3 days later, a second B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. The bomb killed about 40,000 people. With the dropping of the second bomb, Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender in World War II. He announced this surrender over radio on August 15, 1945. He cited the bomb's devastating power by calling it a bomb of new and most cruel power.